Good morning. It's good to see everybody. So happy you are here today. Welcome to Third Coast Church. So glad that you're here. We are going to continue on in this series, Love, Romance, and the Fine Print, where we have been talking about love and romance and fine print every week. It's right there in the title. But this has been a series that is for everyone who has some type of relationship, right? So whether that is a dating relationship or a marriage relationship or family relationships or work relationships or friend relationships, all of us in here have a need to better understand what it means to love as Christ has loved us. And so throughout this series, hopefully you have found some handholds and some reminders and some encouragement to think about how we love others in our lives. And we're going to continue on today as we think about that. Now, a few months ago, we redid the guest room in our house to make it a little bit more of an office for me. And since I was going to be the one in there, we put up some things on the walls that there's just no other way to say it. They're kind of about me, right? That's just what, and they're really around two big accomplishments that I've done about my education. And then there's some things related to running the Marine Corps Marathon. I did that in the fall. They're just pictures. My family has given me a lot of grief for this and called this room a shrine unto myself. I don't experience that. I feel like it's just a really well-apportioned room, right? I walk in there, I feel great joy. But these two things are some pretty big accomplishments in my life. They are some things that I'm pretty proud of. They took a lot of effort. I was in my PhD program for 6 years after finishing my master's degree and after doing bachelor, I was in school for a long time. And so to be at that moment that was really the pinnacle of education, that's pretty exciting. And to finish the marathon, this thing that I had trained for months and months and months and months and months to actually go and to do it, those are some really big accomplishments. I don't know what you might hang up if you had that same opportunity, maybe to create an office and you were going to put some things, maybe education might be up there, but maybe there would be other moments that you might want to commemorate. Maybe it's the starting of a business, right? Or maybe it's look at all of the books and things that I have read, or maybe look at this friend group and this thing that we did. Whatever it might be, there are some accomplishments that you have, and here's what I know about all of those great accomplishments. Not trivial things, but those things that we would say these really matter in our life, is that none of those accomplishments were achieved because we were chasing happiness, right? You didn't do any of those things because you were trying to pursue happiness. Luke, could you help me by going to the next slide, my man? It's, for some reason, is not advanced. There it is. Perfect. Thank you. None of those things were achieved because we were chasing happiness first and foremost, right? All of those things maybe had some moments of happiness along the way, but that was not the predominant emotion that we experienced. For me, reading thousands of pages a semester, getting up early to write before work, running in all the heat and the humidity of Corpus, those things had the moments where they were enjoyable, but happiness was not the characteristic that I would list on those mornings when I was getting up early. All of them were hard. They were a struggle. You see, the accomplishments that matter the most to us come from committing to something that is costly, that matters in our life. That's where the accomplishments come from. Today, as we turn to the topic of marriage. Man, this clicker is just not going to be my friend today. There it is. All right. Nope, can you go back for me? There it is. Perfect. Thank you, Luke. We may have to do this tag team today. Marriage has a higher goal than immediate happiness, right? Our topic today, marriage, is one of the biggest commitments that you will ever make in your entire life. If you think in terms of finances, there is never going to be a bigger commitment that you will make than marriage. It is the most significant financial decision you'll ever make. If you think in terms of length, I went to a funeral yesterday, and this husband and wife, the wife passed away, but they had been married for 68 years. That is a long, long time, a lifelong commitment to one person. There's just not many things that we will commit to that will be longer than that. And in terms of struggle and work and learning and growing, there is nothing that is quite like a marriage relationship. So here's the fine print of today's sermon is that marriage is intended to make us holy rather than to make us happy. Marriage, the intention of it is to make us holy, not to make us happy. In the same way that all of our significant undertakings in life have a different goal than simply sheer pleasure, marriage has a greater purpose than happiness. And to chase happiness as your primary goal of a marriage is to set yourself up for incredible disappointment. So we're going to turn to Ephesians chapter 5 today. It's on page 919 of your Bible that's right in front of you. And so we're going to look at Ephesians 5. This is one of the most familiar passages about marriage because it is the longest discussion of the marriage relationship in the entire New Testament. So it's oftentimes one of those primary texts that we turn to. If you're going to look at one passage, this is the one. But the letter to the church in Ephesus has a bigger focus than marriage. This wasn't like it was Paul's marriage letter. No, it talks about a whole lot of things. And when we look even specifically at chapter 5, we'll see that there is a broader focus than simply just marriage. Chapter 5 begins this way. Paul says, therefore. Really, chapter 5 is when things start to take a turn in Ephesians. He goes from just discussing the theological matters of the letter to now some application. How do you live? And this is what Paul says, therefore, be imitators of God as beloved children, and walk in love as Christ loved us and gave himself up for us, a fragrant offering and sacrifice to God. Now, look carefully at some things that are contained in this verse. First, he says to be imitators of God. That Greek word there is the word that we get the idea of mimic from. So to mimic or to copy. If you think about the people that maybe you've seen and you're like, oh, I want to copy their style. Or I want to kind of like imitate their voice. Or I want to like mimic exactly the way that they handle themselves. That's what he's saying we do as God. We are trying to imitate God. We are trying to copy or mimic the way in which we have learned and seen God at work in our world. And Paul says we do that like beloved children, right? The way you might notice when there is like a dad standing a certain way and then his son is standing there right next to him trying to stand the exact same way as their dad, right? Or a mom and her daughter, and the daughter is wearing the same thing as her mom, or carrying herself in that same sort of way, having those same sort of mannerisms, or maybe even the way you catch yourself saying something, and you're like, that's how my dad says that thing, right? That's what my mom would do. Paul is saying we emulate, we imitate, we mimic, we copy what God does. And the way that we do that, he says in verse 2, is that we are called to walk in love as Christ loved us. You see, our holiness, our way in which we imitate God, is demonstrated in Christ-like love, in sacrificial love. The way in which we strive to be like God is demonstrated in the way that we sacrificially love other people. That is what Paul tells us in Ephesians. This is how we're supposed to carry ourselves, what our life is supposed to look like. And then a few verses later, right before Paul begins to break this down and how it shows up in the marriage relationship, Paul writes a very practical application of walking in love. And he says in verse 21 that as believers, we are called to submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Now, submission is not the kind of word that we probably love to hear or to think about or find like as a call on our life. But this is what biblical submission means. Submitting in the Bible means to reject self-centeredness and to work for the good of another. When we talk about submitting, what we're saying is, I'm going to take the attention off of me. I'm going to reject being self-focused and self-centered, and instead, I'm going to try and work for somebody else's good. I'm going to put the attention on someone else. And this is something that we see throughout the New Testament. Romans 12:10 says that we are to honor one another as greater than ourselves. Philippians 2 says, do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourselves. This is a common refrain in the early New Testament church, is that we don't care for ourselves first, that we don't practice self-centeredness. Instead, we submit by showing honor to one another, that we lift other people up ahead of ourselves. Now, the New Testament does get kind of specific about submission, and in fact identifies several areas in which we can practice submission. One of the ways is that we submit to spiritual leaders. It says in Hebrews chapter 13, it says that we should be subject to our spiritual leaders. In Romans 13:1, it says that we are subject to government authority. And in 1 Peter 2, chapter 13, it says that we ought to be subject to every human institution. And in fact, if you notice, all of those actually come from different writers of the New Testament. From Hebrews, from Peter, from Paul. You see, this was a common idea. This idea that we would practice submission in all domains, all areas of our life. And so it ought to be no surprise then, when we get to marriage, that once again, Paul would say this is an area in which we are called to submit to one another. Marriage is perhaps the greatest opportunity we have to practice submission, as it is the closest human relationship we will ever have. So let's look at what Paul says. He says, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ, and then he gets specific. So, starting in verse 22, Paul says, wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church, his body, and is himself its Savior. Now, as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit in everything to their husbands. Then to husbands, in verse 25, husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the word, so that he might present the church to himself in splendor, without spot or wrinkle or any such thing, that she might be holy and without blemish. In the same way, husbands should love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. For no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it, just as Christ does the church, because we are members of his body. Okay, so this is a common conversation, something probably you've read before. If you've ever thought to read about marriage in the New Testament, you've come across this set of instructions. Now, Paul was not just creating something new here. There was actually already a precedent for writing these kinds of instructions to family relationships. And in the Roman times, this Hellenistic world that they lived, Greek influence, there were these household codes that gave very specific instructions for this is how a family is supposed to conduct itself. And within the Roman society, the male was seen as the ruler of the house. There's this expression, pater familias. Maybe you've heard that before, but pater familias means that the man, the husband, had absolute authority, ruled over everything within the household, over his wife, over anybody who worked for the household, over their children. That was the code in their times, the pater familias, these household codes. So Paul isn't building necessarily something entirely new. When his audience in Ephesus would have received this, they would have at least been familiar with kind of this household code idea. But Paul isn't just copying what already existed. In fact, he's actually using those household codes as the foundation and a familiar concept for something that is radically changed within God's kingdom. You see, here in these verses, Paul is giving two commands, right? Two ideas. Wives, submit to your husbands, and husbands, love your wives. Now, those terms, submit and love. Submit and love. We got to bring our own definition to those sometimes. And when we read them 2,000 years later, it's easy for us to kind of read back in our own meaning, our own understanding of those words. When we read the word submission, if I'm honest, the first thing that comes to mind for me is the submission within MMA, right? Like to win by submission. And how do you win? It's by completely subjugating and immobilizing the other person and putting them in such a painful position that they would then just give up. That is not what the New Testament is saying here, right? Wives, you should just fight until you give up because of intense pain and domination by your husbands, right? That doesn't make any sense in the context of the entire New Testament. But that's what I read, right? I hear submit and I think about subservience. I think about inferiority. I think about being controlled. In the same way, love for so many can be this ethereal idea. Oh, it's just these feelings, right? Oh, it's these grand ideas. Oh, it's just having butterflies in your stomach. But love throughout the New Testament is never just a feeling. It's never something ethereal. No, it is far more practical and concrete than that. And we can actually take both of those words, submit and love, and we can use the rest of the New Testament to better define them for us. And so instead of these simple just statements, we can actually read back in the definitions of those words. And we see, wives, what are you called to do? Reject self-centeredness and work for the good of your husbands. Husbands, what are you called to do? Husbands, you are called to lay down your life and to sacrifice for your wives. Are these totally different ideas? Okay, in one sense, yes. Paul is not just being sloppy with words and he's got a thesaurus and he's like, let me just kind of keep using words. No, that's not what he's doing at all. But look at the shape of both of those commands. Submission here is simply one greater expression of what's already been said in verse 21, submitting to one another out of reverence for Christ. It's a Christ-like posture of putting another's good ahead of your own. Love here isn't a vague feeling. It's a call to lay down your life like Jesus did at the cross. So are they different? Yes, but you could really say they're just two sides of the same coin. A wife reflects Christ by a posture of trust and self-giving toward her husband, and a husband reflects Christ by using whatever strength and responsibility he has to sacrificially serve his wife. Now, in their world, part of this would not have been revolutionary at all. When Paul was writing this, in their word, telling a wife to submit would not have been breaking news whatsoever. The Roman household codes assumed that women were under male authority. Roman household codes, they assumed that they were under male authority. And then when we look at the New Testament, we would have seen this call to submit over and over and over again. Submit to one another, honor others above yourself. So that wouldn't have been shocking when Paul writes, wives, submit to your husband. The shock in this passage isn't that wives are told to submit. The shock is that husbands, the ones that everyone already saw as the head, were told to love like Christ. You see, in their context, in their cultural milieu, everyone would have already assumed that the husband was the head of the home. He was the honored one. He was the one with the authority. Paul uses that same image here, but he fills it with Christ's way of leading. You see, even in our own bodies, if we take that idea of the head, we instinctively know that the head is precious, right? You can lose a limb and still survive, but you cannot lose your head and survive. The head is the most protected, most honored part of the body, which makes what Paul is saying here so radical. The most honored part is called to lay itself down for the good of the rest of the body. You see, the head doesn't say, protect yourself at all costs and survive and sacrifice the body. No, the head doesn't sacrifice the body. The head gives itself to guard and guide and to give life to the body. The example in all of this, Paul says, is Christ. You see, this behavior, to think about the head, the husband sacrificially loving his family, that would have actually been shameful in their larger culture, but this is honorable in God's kingdom. Christ didn't use the rights of his headship for his own gain, and in the same way, husbands are to sacrifice for, not dominate their wives. This whole pattern actually only makes sense because of Jesus, because he used his headship not to take, but to give, not to dominate, but to die. You see, in God's design, headship is not about getting your way. It is about carrying the weight of sacrificial responsibility for the one you love. And if we agree to that, and if we believe that that's true, then the health of a marriage can't be measured by who gets their way or who has the most say, No, it's measured by how both husband and wife are imitating Christ in the way that they give themselves for one another. Now, perhaps as we think about, maybe what we're hoping is that I'm going to say, or the word that I'm going to use, is that there ought to be equality in marriage, that everything ought to be equal. The problem is that the New Testament doesn't talk about marriage in terms of perfectly equal experiences and outcomes. And that's a terrible measurement, honestly, for a successful marriage. Now, let me be really clear. I'm not talking about equality socially, politically, racially, or any other sphere. I'm not denying the equal worth and dignity of men and women. Both are made in the image of God. What I am pushing back on is this idea of using fairness of experience as the primary scoreboard in marriage. You see, if by equality we mean that we're always going to have the same outcomes, that's impossible. It'd be like trying to measure like these two shapes, right? Like is that better? Is it better to be yellow than blue? Are they the same size? Like we cannot measure if we have the same outcomes. Let me give this to you real practically. Like, think about if you really did want to say, we want to have an equal marriage in which everything is split. We all have the same experiences, right? Let's think about something simple like loading the dishwasher. Okay, easy, right? We ought to just load the dishwasher the same amount of times each week. That seems equal and that seems fair. Except if you've ever loaded dishwashers, you know sometimes you load it and it's only 2 water cups and a fork. Then the other time, it's like somebody did a reenactment of Ratatouille, right? It's like, this is not fair. This is not equal, right? Okay, so let's go even further and say we really want to commit to this. So what we're going to do is we're going to count the number of bowls and dishes and forks and everything, and that will make it equal. Except again, sometimes you get the load when everything has been rinsed and left to soak, and then there's other times where somebody was seeing if they could turn dried oatmeal into concrete, right? And it's like, I am going to have to take a chisel to get that off there before I can load the dishwasher. It doesn't work. You see, if equality is the measure, one slight difference wrecks the whole thing. Equality does not work because equality is searching for equal outcomes. But if mutual submission is the measure, everything changes. Now we're in a competition to see who can serve more. Now we're racing to see who can honor the other. And now we're doing our best to grow in holiness without constantly worrying about whether or not we're getting our fair share. And we do all of this because of Christ's example. See, it says in Philippians that he did not consider equality with God a thing to be grasped. But what he did was he emptied himself and he took the form of a servant. He shows us that the path to joy is not about clutching onto our rights to make everything an equal experience, but instead giving ourselves away in love. Now, this is a great idea, right? We would all maybe sit here and say, this is great. I love this idea. But the truth is, in relationships, this tends to break down in some really predictable ways. So one of the ways it breaks down is we start to ask this question. Okay, yeah, but who is really in charge, right? Like, okay, that's all fine. Yeah, submit, love. Okay, we hear you, Paul. But like, seriously, who's actually in charge? You know, anytime we seek authority, we're already missing the point. There's this saying in business books that if you have to vote, you've already lost. And if we think about the example of Christ throughout the Gospels, what does he say? He said that the first will be last, right? Christ says about himself, I came to serve, not to be served. Christ did not seek authority, and any authority that was given to him existed for service. So any authority within the marriage relationship exists to serve the other and not for our own prestige and not to have our own rights. So if we're asking this question, we're already looking in the wrong direction. What about this? Well, they aren't doing what they're supposed to do, right? Like that's fine. I hear you, and I really hope that my wife is listening because Paul was talking to her, right? Like, I am perfect at this, but she really stinks and never does it, right? Like, they aren't doing what they're supposed to do. Well, the great thing is Paul does not include any conditions here. He doesn't say, wives, submit to your husbands as long as da-da-da-da-da. Or husbands, love your wives like Christ loved the church, as long as your wife is ... No, this is a call for unconditional submission and unconditional love. See, the fact is, someone has to go first in the relationship. If you wait for the other one to do the thing and they're waiting on you, nothing ever gets done. Someone has to say, I will go first. I'll love even when you're not at your best, and I'll submit even when you're not at your best. What about this? I guess what Paul's saying is I just never get to have an opinion, right? Like that's what it means, right? If I'm going to submit or love, it just means that I just have to I never get to say my thing. Of course not, right? Vibrant discussion, lively debate, those kinds of things should be the hallmark of a strong marriage. Of course you want to influence your spouse. Right? Of course you want to spur them on. Of course you have some opinions and some ideas and you want to be able to discuss those. In fact, sometimes it's a gift that you give somebody else when you say, I actually have some thoughts on that, and I'd love for you to know kind of what I'm thinking. It, of course, does not mean that you never get to have an opinion. What about this? So it just means I have to say yes to everything? Well, of course not. No, that's not what Paul is saying here at all. In fact, you should never agree to sin. Paul is not saying here in terms of wives submitting to husbands and husbands loving their wife that must mean, well, they're calling me to do something that's sinful, so therefore I must do it. No, you should never agree to sin. That is never okay. There's just never a moment where that is going to be all right. In fact, the apostles reached a point where they had to say, we must obey God we must obey God rather than men. It also means you don't have to do something that would demean the Imago Dei. And I want to be very, very clear on this. You should never remain in harm's way. You should never remain in abuse, whether that's physically, emotionally, or spiritually. The Bible does not give permission for abusive behavior. And too often these verses get twisted around and weaponized for that exact purpose. That is not Paul's intention at all. Now, perhaps as you hear all of this, you might be thinking this last thing just doesn't sound very fun or romantic, right? Like this is not exactly the Valentine's Day message today, right? Like this is not very fun nor romantic. Well, if fun and romantic means that all of my hopes and all of my wishes are going to be fulfilled and that I get a life where my dreams are first and foremost, then yes, it is not very fun or romantic to call us to submission and honor and sacrificial love. That is true, but that's a pretty bad way of entering a marriage to begin with. Gary Thomas, in his book Sacred Marriage, says that good marriages aren't just found. It's not like they're just laying on the ground and you can just go pick them up. No, a good marriage is something you make. It's something you work for. But it's wrong to say that it's no fun, right? It's wrong to say that there is no joy. In fact, marriage is incredibly joyful and filled with immense joy.